So moving on to Section 4, Joint and Solidary Obligation. Article 1207. The concurrence of two or more creditors or two or more debtors in one and the same obligation does not imply that each one of the former has the right to demand or that each one of the latter is bound to render entire compliance with the prestation. There is a solidary liability only when the obligation expressly so states, or when the law or the nature of the obligation requires solidarity. Article 1208. If from the law or the nature or the wording of the obligations to which the preceding article refers, the contrary does not appear, the credit or debt shall be presumed to be divided into as many equal shares as there are creditors or debtors, the credits or debts being considered distinct from one another, subject to the rules of court governing the multiplicity of suits. So I will elaborate the articles later. So there are two kinds of obligations according to the number of parties. First is the individual obligation, or one where there is only one obligor and one obligee. And next is the collective obligation, one where there are two or more debtors and creditors, and it may be joint or solidary. So what is a solidary obligation? A solidary obligation is one where each one of the debtors is bound to render, and or each one of the creditors has a right to demand from any debtor's entire compliance with the prestation, according to Article 1207. So in other words, it is where each of the debtors kay obliged magpay sa obligation, and ang creditors has the right to demand payment or fulfillment sa obligation sa mga debtors. Next is, what is a joint obligation? A joint obligation is one where the whole obligation is to be paid or fulfilled proportionately by the different debtors and or is to be demanded proportionately by the different creditors according to Article 1208. So sa joint daw, kay ang obligation must be paid or fulfilled proportionately. Meaning, kung unsay lang agreement kung pila ilahang nasabutan, mao ra sad ang ilahang portion na bayaran sa mga debtors. So in conclusion, ang difference sa joint ug solidary. Ang joint is presumed by law, while solidary, not presumed. It must be expressly stipulated by the parties, or when the law or the nature of the obligation requires solidarity. Ang joint pod, each debtor is liable only for a proportionate part of the entire debt, while solidary, each debtor is obliged to pay the entire obligation. Sa joint, each creditor is entitled only to a proportionate part of the credit, and sa solidary, each creditor has the right to demand from any of the debtors the payment or fulfillment of the entire obligation. Collective obligation presumed to be joint. If A is liable to B for 9,000, there can be no problem regarding the determination of the following. First, the person liable to pay, the person entitled to demand payment, the extent of the liability of the debtor, and the extent of the right of the creditor. Number 2, when there is plurality of parties, two or more debtors or creditors, and the share of each in the obligation is specified, the correlative rights and obligations of the parties are known. Thus, if A, B, and C are liable kay D og 9,000, and gistate nga ilahang corresponding share each debtor kay 3,000 pesos, si A, B, ug C kay liable ra jud sila for 3,000 only, and C, D kay dili siya entitled nga mag-collect more than sa ilahang corresponding share each debtor. Number 3, suppose that in the same obligation, the share of each debtor or creditor is not specified. What is the extent of the liability of A, B, and C? In such case, the presumption is that the obligation is joint. And as a consequence, there are as many debts as there are debtors, there are as many credits as there are creditors. The debts or credits are considered distinct and separate from one another. Each debtor is liable only for a proportionate part of the debt, and each creditor is entitled only to a proportionate part of the credit. So example ani is si A, B ug C kay nagborrow og 9,000 kang D, and ang presumption is that A, B, and C are jointly liable. Diri na ay tulo ka debts and isa ka credit. D can only demand 3,000 each from A, B, C, a total of 9,000. Since ang debts are distinct and separate from each other, ang insolvency sa isa ka debtor shall not make other debtors liable. Another situation kay A borrowed from B, C, and D in the amount of 9,000. In this case, nay isa ka debt and tulo ka credit. Each creditor can only demand 3,000 from A. Another situation kay A borrowed from B, C, and D in the amount of 9,000. In this case, nay isa ka debt and tulo ka credit, and each creditor can only demand 3,000 from A. So, another situation kay A and B are liable to C and D for 9,000. The same presumption applies. In this case, na ay duha ka debts and duha ka credits. So, each creditor can demand only 4,500 from either debtor kay 9,000 man niya duha ka debts. So, 4,500 each. Presumption subject to rules on municipality of suits. The presumption in Article 1208 is made subject to the rules of court governing the municipality of suits. Otherwise, situations may arise where there are as many suits as there are debtors and creditors. The rules on municipality of suits seek to prevent the filing of two or more suits or complaints for a single cause of action, or the same violation of the legal right of the plaintiff. So, words used to indicate joint liability. Other words used for joint obligations are mancomunadamente, pro rata, proportionately, we promise to pay, signed by two or more persons. When obligation is solidary. Solidary liability is not lightly inferred. Under Article 1207, there is solidary liability only when the obligation expressly so states, the law requires solidarity, and the nature of the obligation requires solidarity. Words used to indicate solidary liability. Example of other words used to indicate solidarity are jointly or severally, solidaria, in solidum, together or separately, individually or collectively, juntos o separadamente, I promise to pay, signed by two or more persons. So there are kinds of solidarity. First is according to parties bound. Passive solidarity. It is the solidarity on the part of the debtors where any one of them can be made liable for the fulfillment of the entire obligation. It is in the nature of a mutual guarantee. So any debtor daw can be made liable. Di para sa joint nga tagsa-tagsa gid sila og bayron nun diri pwede ra isa ra sa debtor ang mag-extinguish or fulfill sa obligation. So example of this is A and B are solidary debtors of C in the amount of 10,000. So, nay isa ka debt, ang debt ni A ug B kang C. And nay isa ka credit, ang credit ni C against A and B. C may demand payment from either A or B, or both of them simultaneously, of their whole obligation. Payment from either A or B extinguishes the obligation, but kung si A ang nagbayad lugar, pwede siya mag-claim from B sa iyang dapat nga share. Depende sa ilang agreement kung pila. And C cannot collect more than 10,000, which is the extent of his credit. So next is active solidarity. Solidarity on the part of the creditors, where any one of them can demand fulfillment of the entire obligation. Its essential feature is that of mutual representation among the solidary creditors with powers to exercise the rights of others in the same manner.